Before we now dive deeper into other JavaScript topics, and there are many other topics left, I think it's time to practice programming with classes with this object-oriented approach again. Though I will say this module is entirely optional. If you're not interested in this, or if you want to practice a little bit later, you can just skip this module and continue to the next one. Now, in the next module, we'll actually use the result, the little application we work on from this module, but of course you'll find the finished app, the finished project, attached at the beginning of next module. So if you skip this one, you'll not see the process how we got there, but you'll get the result, and the result will only contain things you already learned. So skipping this module is possible, but if you feel like practicing, I would definitely recommend that you dive into it right now with me. In this module, we'll work on this little application, this little demo here, and you will find this starting project attached to this in the next lecture. And in the end, what you'll find there is what we always work with, an HTML file with some content in there, some styles, and an empty script file. And we'll work on this script file, we'll populate it with some live, and we'll make sure that we can click the Finish button or the Activate button and move items around from box A, from the Active Projects box, to the Finished Projects box, and the other way around. So nothing too fancy, but plenty of opportunities to practice a lot of the things we learned thus far. So without further ado, I'd say let's dive right in. And of course, feel free to pause this section right now and try this on your own first, or pause from time to time whilst we go through this mini demo here, so that you can also try out things on your own before we then do it together. I will show you my approach, my solution here. As always in programming, there will be more than one possible solution, and therefore I would definitely recommend that you also try this on your own first, or that you temporarily or from time to time pause and try the next steps on your own first before you then follow along with me, because that will help you find out where you need to practice more, what you already know pretty well, and so on. So the goal is to make these buttons work, and of course that sounds very trivial. Now, the first important decision we'll have to make is whether we want to use classes, whether we want to use an object-oriented approach or not. Both works and both is okay. You could go into your script file and just dump in a couple of consts where you kind of select all the buttons, add event listeners, work with some global arrays here. You probably want one array of projects for the first box and one array of projects for the second box. And then you move items between these boxes, between these two arrays, and you also update the DOM by moving the elements there. You can do that, and you can do it with or without classes. Now, since we worked a lot with classes in the last modules, I will use classes here to also practice this object-oriented approach and this OOP way of thinking a bit more. And therefore, I will not throw in a couple of global constants. Instead, I will start by defining a couple of classes which we then can work on. Now, which classes would that be though? Now, of course, as I said, there are many ways of structuring this. I will create a class, a project list class, which in the end manages all the projects of one box. I will also create a class for a single project item, so for such a rendered item. And keep in mind, we'll not have to render these items, they're already there, but we'll have to add some logic to read them from the DOM and populate some JavaScript logic with data that can be found in the DOM. I'll also add a class that manages the app overall. And I'll also add a class, a tooltip class, which helps us display a tooltip when we click on this button. So therefore, if we go back, I'll add a class tooltip, which will be helpful for this more info button. I will add another class, project item, because I got a couple of projects here, and a single item there should be managed with a project item class, which then is responsible for listening on clicks on that finish or activate button. Of course, we got multiple projects though, and we're managing them in multiple lists. So I'll add another class here, the project list class, so that we can create multiple instances of this class for the different lists we have. And as I said, I will add an app class. Now, these might not be all classes we work with in this module, but these are the classes with which I want to start. Now, speaking of getting started, the interesting thing about this project is that we already have some items rendered here. This could be a page we're getting from some server where this page was created and rendered on the server, so to say, where the HTML code was created on the server, I mean. And now in the front end, in the browser, we just want to add some JavaScript so that we can't add new items or delete them, but we can move them between the boxes. And this would be a common use case, a common scenario, by the way. You're not always building applications where you manage everything in the browser with JavaScript. It's quite common to also have applications where the HTML code is pre-generated on the server, and you, with your JavaScript in the browser, you only want to add some interactions to that content. And that's exactly what we're doing here. Therefore, our HTML code is the source of truth, we could say. The data we're interested in, things like the IDs of the projects, are part of that HTML code. And therefore, we need some logic, some code to parse the HTML code, parse the two different sections we have, which are these boxes which hold the projects, to find out which projects with which ID are currently active and which are finished, so that thereafter we can add logic to switch these elements and switch these projects in code. So therefore, here in app, I'll start by adding an init method, and I'll turn this into a static method because we'll only call this once, basically, like this, so that I call init right when this script parses and executes for the first time. And in init, we could now add the logic to parse the different items. But actually, I created this project list class, right? So if you think about it, it would make sense that it's a task of the project list class, or of an instance created based on the class, to parse its content and find out which projects belong to that list. So we can create two instances of this list class, one for each box, and then we tell it to which box with which ID it is connected, so that the list itself can do the parsing. So let's go to the project list then and continue there before we go back to app init. In the project list, we can add a constructor, because my goal is to create two project lists here in init, in the app class, because we have two project boxes, two, well, lists of projects. And then when such a project list is constructed, when it is instantiated, that project list should get all the information it needs, for example, whether it's for the active or finished projects, and then parse all the related projects. So here in project list, it would make sense to expect the type of project list in the constructor, because we have two types. We have basically the active projects with this ID here, and we have the finished projects with this ID on the surrounding section. So therefore, here in init and app, we could create an active projects list with new project list, where we instantiate this, and as a type parameter, here we could pass in active. And then we repeat this process for the finished projects list, where we pass in finished. So active and finished, and I actually chose words which we find in the exact same way in the HTML file. Finished, this part here, and active. Thereafter, we always have dash projects, but that's the same for both boxes, only the identifier at the beginning, active and finished, differs. So now with that information passed into project list, here in the constructor, we can start reaching out to the items that are part of that list. So here we can add a project items constant, for example, and then use document query selector all to get a list of items and not just the first matching item, where we then can use a template expression here to define the string, our query string. And there, I want to look for a certain ID, and that ID, and that's why I'm using the backticks here and that template literal, that ID will take my type into account, because I'm looking for my sections here with the ID finished projects or active projects. So here we can inject or interpolate, however you want to call it, type-projects, so that this type thing is dynamic. And then not just all these sections, but actually I'm interested in the items in there, so I'm interested in the list items. So this is my CSS selector for all list items in the sections with these IDs. Now, if we quickly console log project items, just to verify whether we're on the right path, and then save this and go back and reload here, we should see two node lists, one with 2 list items, that's the first box, the active projects, and one with 1 list item, and that's that last box here, the finished projects. So that's a solid start. Now we have access to these items in the DOM. Now we can read information from these DOM nodes, and actually there's one piece of information I'm interested in, and that's the ID. So let's continue with that now. So let's now use these queried or these fetched project items from the DOM to get some information from them. We can use a for loop for that and go through all the project items of project items like this. And these are my DOM nodes here, right? That's what I'm going through. Now I'm not interested in the full node, I'm interested in the ID, because we could say a project list also has a projects field. And initially this is an empty array, let's say. Now keep in mind, fields are translated to properties, and actually they are translated to properties just as if you would specify them in your constructor. And conveniently, actually the fields are converted to properties before your other constructor logic runs, after any super constructor was called, if you had any. And therefore here we can conveniently reach out to projects and push items into projects. And what I want to push here are my project items. So not the IDs, but actually instances of the project item class, which currently of course doesn't do too much. Well, even though the project item class is empty, we can still instantiate it by calling new project item. And even though right now we have no constructor in there, I want to pass in my ID, which I can get from project item.id. With .id here, we access the ID property of the DOM node, which holds the same value as set on the ID attribute here. So with that, we're getting access to this ID string, which is part of the DOM. And I forward that to the project item. So in project item, even though we're not doing much else, we can at least add the constructor now, expect an ID here, and set this ID equal to ID maybe, so that we store that ID we're getting as a parameter in an instance property. Back to the project list now. We went through all the project items and we created project item objects based on them, so that we have a JavaScript representation of the DOM nodes, so to say, without all the other HTML content, without the title and so on, just focusing on the ID at the moment. And therefore here we now should have a project list which at least manages some data about the DOM nodes it's connected to. At least we manage the IDs now. So if we save that, and after this for loop we console log this projects to have a look at this array, and we save that and then reload, we see we got an array with objects now, not DOM node objects, but simpler objects, which in the end just have an ID property, right? That's what we have in there. And that's a good start. This is something we can build up on. So what could we do as a next step now that we have these simple project items created? Well, it would make sense to add an event listener to the finish or to the activate button, so that we can get started adding some logic to that. Now, where is the place where the event listener should be added? Well, I would say in the project item, because in the end we have that project item to manage a single item. So we want this project item to manage its connected DOM node. So here in project item, I'll add a new function, and I'm only adding a new function so that the constructors can stay lean and is easier to read. And I'll name this function connect switch button, because in the end the button is there to switch from active to finished or finished to active. And I'm creating a new method here which I call from inside of the constructor, simply to keep the constructor cleaner. I'll also add another method which I'll name connect more info button. Same logic, I will call it from inside of the constructor here. Connect more info button, simply to keep that leaner. Now let's start with the switch button though. So in the switch button here, in the connect switch button method, I want to get access to that switch button and add an event listener. So to get access, we of course need to get access to the DOM node. So to the project item element, if you want to call it like this. Of course, the constant name is up to you. And we can get this with document get element by ID because the ID is something we're storing here, right? So we can say get by ID. This ID is the value we want to use. Therefore, you have to make sure you're storing the ID in this property before you call this method, because in this method, we rely on this property. So with that, we get access to the underlying DOM node object. Now we just need to get access to the button in there. So to the switch button, if you want to call it like that. For that, we can reach out to the project item element, which we just selected here in line number 13. And in there, with query selector, I want to find the last button. And we can do this, for example, with button last of type, because I have two buttons in there in every list item, these two buttons. And the last button is this button which switches the project from box A to box B or the other way around. So now it's this switch button where we can add an event listener. And of course, that should be a click event listener because we want to react to button clicks. And then here, what should be executed? That's a tricky question. Well, in the end here, I want to trigger a method which should actually be part of the project list, I would say. To be precise, I want to trigger multiple methods, you could say. We need to remove this project item from the project list it's currently in, and then add it to the other project list. And now there are various ways of achieving this. We could work with a static class again, which in the end then can be called from inside the item or from inside of any list instance to kind of let that static class manage this for us. But here I'll show you an approach which we haven't used like this before, but we learned about all the core components of that. We can use a callback function, so to say. In the project list, let's start with that. In the project list, we need two methods, as I said in the end. One is to switch the element away, so to switch the project. We could name it switch project. The idea is that here we remove the project from the projects array we have in that list because it will be switched to the other list. And then we also call a method in the other list instance to add it there. So since the project list class is used to instantiate these list instances, we have to add the method here, and we could name this add project. So keep in mind, this is a blueprint for our project list instances, and we create two instances. And when we move a project in instance A to instance B, so from active to finished, then we have to trigger a method in instance A, so in active, where we remove the item, and a method in instance B, so in the finished project list, where we add this project then because we're moving it to that list. So here in switch project, removing the item, that's not too hard. We can reach out to this project and we can remove an item with splice, for example. For that, we need to find the index of the project in that array. We can't use index of because a project is an object, and for that, the index of doesn't really work. But we can find it, for example, project index with this project's find index. You learned about this method earlier. And there you can find the index by passing in that anonymous function where you receive every element that is part of the array, which you can give any name you want here, p for example. And then here in this anonymous function, I'm using an arrow function. You want to return true if it's the item you were looking for. And my condition for that is that the ID of the item I'm looking at, and again, this will basically be every item in the array because the function is executed for every item in the array. If that is equal to, and now we need to expect that here in switch project, we get the ID of the item that should be switched. So if that's equal. If that is equal, we know, okay, now this function executed on the element in this project, which is the element we want to move. And then this project's find index will return the index of that project in the projects array. So the project index can then be used here in Splice like this, for example. This is an option. A shorter alternative is to set this project equal to this project's filter, so to a filtered list, where we then use almost the same logic, just the opposite. So where we filter for the ID not being equal. Because what does this do? It executes this function here on every element in this project, and it keeps all items where this returns true. So we want to return true for everything but when the ID of the item we're currently looking at in the projects array is equal to the ID of the project we want to remove. Because if they're equal, this is the item we want to remove. So then in filter, we want to return false so that this item is dropped from this newly created array. And this newly created array is then stored back in this project. So that's us removing a project. That's the easier part. Now the trickier part is to make sure that we can now call add project in the other instance of this list. So doing this add project will not work because this would call it in the same instance, right? So that's something we'll have to fix. So we need to call add project from inside the project list, but, and that's the tricky part, in another instance. So we can't use this here, this add project, because this would call it in the same instance. So what can we do regarding that? Well, we can use an approach which we haven't really used before, but we learned about it, and that's a callback function. We can use a callback function. We can expect that, for example, on the constructor here, we get a second argument, not just the type of this list, but also the switch handler function, you could say. We can name it switch handler function. And now we can store this in a property here. This switch handler maybe is equal to switch handler function. By the way, I now also want to store the type here in a property. And now with the switch handler function stored here, this should actually be a pointer at a function. We can call this switch handler, that's my property name here, in switch project, and then here, for example, pass the project which we want to switch, which we can get by reaching out to our projects array. And there with find, not find index, but find, we can get the object for a given criteria, which we pass in this anonymous function. And there I'm interested in the project where the ID is equal to the project ID. So now we pass that project to switch handler. Now the question just is, what is the switch handler function? Where is this coming from? We're receiving it here in the constructor, but right now, of course, down there where we instantiate project list, we're not passing anything in there. Well, that's the thing which we have to do now. I want to pass something in there, so as a second argument to the constructor. And the thing which I want to pass in there, that can be a tricky part. I want to pass in a function which is part of the other instance. And therefore, we actually can't use the constructor because we need both instances to be finished to be able to reach out to them. So let's adjust this a tiny bit, get rid of that constructor argument, cut this line, leave the type assignment here though, and add a new method, set switch handler function, for example, any name of your choice, and there add this logic which you just cut, also accept this argument, of course, and now we can call that on our instances. So down here, where we create the instances, for example, on the active projects list, we can call set switch handler function, and now we can define which function should be called when we in the end then call this property as we do it here. And this should be add project in the other instance, because that will then allow us to here add the logic to receive a project and add it in that instance of project list. So here I want to point at finished project list because I'm setting this up for the active projects list. So I'll point at finished projects list, add project at this function. I don't execute the function here. I don't add parentheses. I just point at the function with that function name, just as we do it on an event listener, for example. Because this function will be executed on our behalf, it will be executed by this line here. Now, one important thing we'll have to do here is we'll have to bind this inside of that receiving function though. We'll have to bind it to finished projects list in this case. Because since we'll be calling this add project function effectively with this line, this inside of add project would normally refer to the same thing this refers to here, and that would be the wrong instance, right? Because we're calling this on the other instance. So we have to bind this in add project to that instance where we want it to execute and not from where we call it. And then we can basically copy that and now replace active projects list with finished projects list, and on the other hand, replace finished projects list here with active projects list. And now we got this set up, and Just to show you what I mean here, we can now console log this here inside of add project to see when this runs. To see something though, we'll need to do one final thing. Switch project here. That is something we now need to connect to our event listener here, which we in turn have in project item. Now, in order to be able to call a method from project list inside of project item, we also have to make sure we get this method into project item. And we can use the constructor for this and accept a second argument, which we maybe could call update project lists. And then store this here in a property. Update project lists is equal to update project lists. Or maybe call this update project lists function to make it clear that this is a function. And here add handler at the end to be consistent with the naming. And now this will be expected to point at a function because I'll pass in this second argument to project item here when we create a project item here in project list. And there I want to pass in switch project. So here we can pass in this switch project. Important, here we need to bind this so that this inside of switch project refers to this class here and not to project item or to the event source to be precise, because now I'll bind this event listener to this update project list handler, which in the end will then just execute whatever we pass in here, so which in the end will execute this switch project method. Now, passing around all these references can be confusing. I am aware of this. It is a way of ensuring that our classes or our instances can communicate with each other. And for example, you can use the debugging tools, which I showed you in the debugging section, and set some breakpoints to better understand the flow of information here if you're having problems following along with that. For now, if we save that and we reload and we click on finish, we see this being logged. Right? Because I'm logging this here in add project, and that's in the end what's getting called here. And there we see, okay, this now was called in the finished list, even though I clicked on it here in the active projects list. And this proves that our logic works because now we want to add it in the finished projects list, and therefore add project should run in the finished projects list. So this is working. The next step is now to ensure that we add logic here to indeed add that project in the finished project list, and that we also move the DOM element, of course. Now, regarding the logic to add a project here, first of all, we have to accept the project here as an argument because we will be receiving it. In the end, we're calling add project over a couple of corners in this line, and here we're passing a project to this function. So since we effectively call add project there, we should accept the project here. Now, to add it in this list where this is getting called, we can of course reach out to the projects array there and push project onto it. Now that's the first step. Now we moved it in JavaScript from the array in instance A to the array in instance B. So from the array in active projects to the array in finished projects, for example. That's the first step, but it's not the final step. We also need to move the DOM node, of course. And for that, we could add the logic here right in this method. But actually, I will create a new class also to demonstrate more examples for classes, of course. And I'll name it helper or DOM helper because I want to outsource this DOM logic, in this case, into this class with a static method, which I'll name move element. And move element should take the element ID of the element that should be moved and the new destination selector, let's say. So that in move element, we can reach out to that element and store it in a constant with document get element by ID, passing in element ID, and then get the destination element with document query selector and pass in the new destination selector argument. And then we can use the destination element and in the end append element. And as you learned, if you're doing this to a DOM node that's already part of the DOM and you're appending it again in another place of the DOM, then it will not be copied or anything like that. It will be moved, which is exactly what I want here. So with that, we should be moving that element. And therefore now, if we go down to add project, we can use helper And then, since we created a static method there, we can call move element and pass in project ID, which in the end is my element ID I want to move. And the new destination selector, that can be created with backticks so that we can insert something dynamic there. Because in the end here, I want to move this to a selector where we select an ID. And then the dynamic thing is this type, which is a property of project list. So for the active list, that's active. For the finished list, that's finished. Dash projects UL. So I want to select the unordered list in the section for the finished or the active projects. And this should move the DOM node. So with that, we're almost there. I just noticed, of course, it's not called the helper, but the DOM helper. But now with that, if we save that and we reload this page and I click on finish, we see cannot read property ID of undefined. So something's wrong with the project here because I'm getting this from line 48, as you can tell. So this is this line. So reading the ID here doesn't work. So let's console log the project. Alternatively, we could, of course, also use breakpoints to see what's inside of that thing. And yeah, it's undefined. So we're not getting our parameter. That's the issue here. Now let's find out why that could be the case. Because here, where I call switch handler, which in the end, due to our setup, should be pointing at add project, there I am passing in a project. So unless this selection fails here, we should be forwarding a project. Well, to find out whether that fails, we can quickly console log our selection logic here and see if that gives us an item. So if we click this, okay, we get undefined here already. So selecting a project in the projects array like that fails. Let's see if we don't get a project ID. That probably is the reason. So if we reload, yeah, instead this points at some strange mouse event object. Let's ignore that for the moment. So indeed, the problem here is that we got no ID. So if we have a look at where we call switch project, it's here, and there we bind this, and we pass switch project to project item. And here in project item, where we then accept this, and there we store it in the update projects list handler in the end. There I assign this to this event listener, and here we probably have our problem. Because here, I'm not passing in the ID of the project, and we should be doing this. So I should bind this here. We don't need to pass in a value for this. We can use null here, but I want to pass in my argument that should be forwarded, and that should be this ID, the ID of this project this is getting triggered on, so that the ID in the end ends up here in switch project, and that therefore allows us to select a project and pass it to add project. So now with that, let's give it a try. Let's save this. And it worked. You see we moved it down there. Now a couple of things are not working yet though. For example, the button text is not updated. And in addition, if we click the button again, we now have a problem. The reason for that problem is that we moved the DOM element, but we didn't really fully update the lists or the item correctly to reflect that the item now is part of a different list. Right now what we're doing is we're making sure we can click that switch button, but once we switch the item for one time, so once we switch it to the other box once, when we try to switch it again, we get an error and it doesn't work. And of course, as I said, the button caption also isn't updated. Now that error is stemming from the fact that we haven't, for example, updated the event listener on the button. It's still the same event listener we set to the button on the project item initially when we created that project item. Now therefore it's still the same event listener for the list it was in originally. So if it started in the active projects, it still has the event listener to switch it from active projects to finished, even though the switch just happened. So what we'll need to do is we'll need to make sure that when we switch a project, we also update that project to change the button caption and to add a new event listener. We probably should do this here in add project. There, we can reach out to the project which we're getting as an argument, and we could call an update method in there, which doesn't exist yet, but which we can create. And to this update method, we should also probably pass our new switch handler that should be used. Because we pass one in when we create the project, we point at this switch project bind this. We should renew this in add project and pass it to update so that we can use it in there. Because when we add a project, that means it switched the lists. It switched from instance A to instance B. And therefore this function to which this project is bound in the end has to be changed because that still points at the old instance, at instance A. The project now is in instance B though, so we have to pass in this switch project as it is defined in instance B. Otherwise, we don't work with the right function that should be called upon a click. I also want to pass in this type here to let the project know in the update method, which we have to add, in which type of list it is, the active or the finished list. This will be important for updating the caption of the button. So with that, let's go to project item, and in there we can add a new method and name it update because that's the name I gave it a couple of lines below. And there we need to accept two things: the update project lists function, the new one, and the type. Now here in the update method, I want to set this update project list handler, so just as I'm doing it here in the constructor, equal to update project lists function, so that we have a new function there that's getting used and not the old one. Now of course we now also need to add the event listener again, and therefore I'll call this connect switch button one more time so that this code runs again, and we basically use the new update project lists handler, which we set here, to set our new event listener. Now this alone would not work correctly though. If we do that, click on finish, you'll see it works kind of, it moves it back, but we get an error. And we actually set up a memory leak here because I'm running connect switch button again, but we never cleared the old event listener there. We added a new one, but the old one also still exists. So we need to get rid of the old event listener first. For that, I'll go back to my DOM helper class here and add a new static method here, which I'll name clear event listeners for an element, because such a functionality is not built into JavaScript. And here I'll create a new or a cloned element by using element clone node true to make a deep clone, and then replace the element with replace with the cloned element. So we basically replace the element with itself, but since we clone it and create a brand new one, we ditch any existing event listeners and they can be garbage collected. Then here I return the cloned element. So this is a little helper function which in the end swaps the element, and now we can call that from inside connect switch button in the end, because there, instead of selecting switch button with a constant, I'll use a variable, and thereafter always call DOM helper clear event listeners for the switch button and set switch button equal to the newly returned element this helper function returns. So this always clears any existing event listeners and makes sure we only add a new one thereafter and we don't accumulate event listeners over time. So now with that, if we reload, this swapping works without errors. Now what's not working is our caption here, or it's working, but it's not updated correctly. Well, to update it, here in connect switch button, besides adding the event listener, we can also set switch button text content equal to, and then maybe expect a type here, that we receive a type which helps us find out to what we want to set it, so that we check if type is equal to active. If that's the case, then I want to set the label to finish, because if we're in the active list, the button should say finish to move it to the finished list, and otherwise say activate. So that's a change I want to add here. Now, of course, that means we need to make sure that type is passed in. It's no problem here in update, because there we get type. We can just forward that. But in the constructor, we at the moment don't know the type. So here we should also expect to get this as an argument and forward it to connect switch button. And in order to get it as an argument here in the project item constructor, we can go to project list where we build a project item and there pass in as a third argument this type, because here we know in which type of list we are. Well, and with that now, if we save that, we can move our items here and the label is also updated. So now that's this move item from A to B logic finished. Let's now focus on the more info button, though for now this will be relatively trivial because we'll just output something in the console. So as I said, I now want to focus on the more info button. For this, in connect more info button, we first of all have to get access to the button, and we can use Similar logic as here in connect switch button. Copy that line to get the project item element itself with the help of its ID, and then get the more info button here with project item element, query selector, and now in there I want to get the first button with button first of type, because the first button we have in there is the more info button. Now, for the moment, I don't know how to get any text which I want to display there, and I also don't want to render any element. Instead, for now, I just want to log something to the console, which we of course could do with console log, but I will use a new class for that, the tooltip class, which then does this logging in its constructor for the moment. But we're not there yet. For now, we need to add an event listener to the button, of course, a click event listener. This should trigger another method here, show more info handler, could be a fitting name. So point at show at this show more info handler here on this click listener. And now here I want to create that tooltip. So I want to, in the end, build my tooltip here with new tooltip. And then let's say call a show method to show it. And for now, again, this will just log something to the console. So in the tooltip class, we can simply add a show method here. And there console log the tooltip. And for the moment, that will be it. If I now save that and I reload and I click on more info, we're outputting the tooltip over there on the right in the console. Now let's actually finish this up by getting a little bit more fancy than that. The tooltip is just showing something in the console at the moment. Now, why don't we make sure it renders some element, even if it's then in the wrong place, but renders some element, let's say, at the bottom of this page, something like that. For that, we can create a new element here in the show method. Tooltip element, something like that, with document create element. And here we can just use a div, then assign a class here, which I prepared in advance, which can be card, so that it has a nicer look. And then just append it with document body append tooltip element like this. If we now save that, give it a try, click on more info. If you scroll to the bottom of the page, you'll see some boxes getting added there. Pretty hard to see, but if you click often enough, there are enough boxes added. Now to see them a bit better, let's add some text there. Text content dummy, because for now I have no better text. With that, if I reload, we see that's getting added. And now I just want to make sure that we can also dispose of such a tooltip by clicking on it. And for that, we need to add an event listener here. So tooltip, add event listener. It's not a button, but we can also listen to clicks on any other element. So here to that div, we add a click listener. And then on the tooltip, we can add a remove method. Or maybe name that detach and name this one here attach. So that it's a bit more generic, but that's up to you. And then here, add event listener click, this dot detach. And here in detach, we now want to remove that tooltip element. To have access to it, I'll store it in an instance property. This element is equal to tooltip element. So now as long as we make sure that this refers to the correct thing in detach, which we can do by using bind this, or as an alternative to also show this, by using this other syntax here for creating a method, this field method syntax, where you learned in the last section that this then actually is added in a bit more of an inefficient way, because this function is now recreated for every instance of tooltip. But for this app, this should be fine. And also to show this alternative, the advantage of this approach when using an arrow function is that this will always refer to the class automatically. So here we can then therefore call this element and refer to the element we're storing down there with this line here, and call remove here. Or if we need to support older browsers, use this element, parent element, remove child, this dot element. This would work in older browsers as well, but I'll go with this shorter modern syntax. And now we should be able to click on a tooltip and get rid of it. Now, since I renamed this to attach, and I don't name it show anymore, we have to change this here to attach. And now if we go back and reload this one more time, click on more info here, for example, scroll to the bottom, click on it, it's getting deleted. Also, of course, if we added multiple tooltips. So this works, and now we can interact with this a bit at least, and we're outputting something. Now, I'm still not fully done though. I want to improve this code a little bit more, though for this simple app, of course, you wouldn't need to do that. But for one, I want to make sure that if we click on this button that should show the tooltip, so when show more info handler, when that function executes, I want to check whether we have an active tooltip so that I can't open more than one tooltip for a given project. And to manage this, I'll add a new property to project item instances. Has active tooltip, which initially is false, because initially there is no active tooltip. But here, when we executed this code, I'll set this to true. So I'll set has active tooltip to true. And then here at the beginning, I'll check if this has active tooltip is true. And if it is, I will return so that I don't execute this code in that case. And we therefore don't open another new tooltip. Now I just need to make sure that when we close a tooltip, so when we detach here, so when this event listener triggers here, I let my project item class know about that so that I can set has active tooltip to false again, so that we are able to open a new one thereafter. To make sure that this works, I'll add a new method here. Close tooltip. And of course, we could do this in detach as well, but soon I want to remove these two from this class and move them into a base class. That's why I'm creating this in a more generic way. So here in close tooltip, to which I'll now bind this here, close tooltip. And therefore, this will now use this trick with the arrow function assigned to the field here. This detach method can now be converted to a normal method. Because here I would now want to call this detach, and therefore this inside of detach will now refer to the correct thing, because I'm calling this now in an arrow function. But here, besides doing that, I also want to call a method which I also receive here through the constructor, let's say. We could name it close notifier function, and then set this close notifier handler equal to close notifier function. Or just name it close notifier here, because I'm not binding this to an event, so I'm fine with naming it like this. And then here in close tooltip, besides detaching it, I'll call this close notifier as a function. And now I just need to make sure that this function is passed in to the tooltip constructor. So in project item where I create a tooltip, there I want to pass in a function that sets has active tooltip to false. And for this, we can add a new method or use a quick anonymous function here, where I just set this has active tooltip to false if this executes. So I'll just do this because it's such a simple function. So with that, we shouldn't be able to open a tooltip more than once. Let's give it a try. Let's reload. Click on more info. A new tooltip was added. If I click this again for the same element, I don't add more tooltips. If I click another button for a different element, we can add it. If I close these tooltips, I can reopen them though. So that seems to work correctly. Yep, looks good. And with all of that, the remaining thing which I want to do is I want to add a base class so that we have detach and attach in a base class, and could reuse that for other elements which we want to add to the DOM or remove from there dynamically as well. So to also practice inheritance again, let's add a base class, and you can name it however you want. I'll name it component. I like this name for a class that in the end is related to controlling parts of the DOM, but you can name it however you want. I'll name it component, and I will take detach and attach, cut it from the tooltip and move it into component, though the attach method here now doesn't really look the way I want it to look. It should look a bit different. It should in the end just be concerned about appending something. So we'll actually cut this part here again from attach, go back to the tooltip, and there add a create or render or however you want to call it method, where I now add this again. And now in the tooltip, I want to call this create from inside the constructor so that this always runs when, well, this class is instantiated. There I then build my tooltip. The only thing which I don't do here is I don't attach it, but I store it here in this element property. And that's also important because I'll be referring to this element property in attach here. And now I just need to extend component here on my tooltip class so that we have access to these two methods here. And as you learned, this inside of these methods will then always refer to the subclass, so that will work fine. This element will be set there when detach is called. Same for when this method is called. Only adjustment here is, of course, that we need to append this element, because that's the element we're setting here. That is our tooltip element. And therefore, with that, we only have to do one more thing. We have to call super in here to call the base class in our own constructor. If you added your own constructor and you're extending another class, you need to call super in your own constructor. And once you did that, we can reload and click on more info, and this should still work as before. Also, the prevention of opening multiple tooltips works fine. And therefore, this now works, and we have this more generic class. Now, the generic class right now isn't doing too many useful things, arguably. So we can at least improve this a little bit. For example, we can add a if check here and check if this element is defined and only try to remove it in that case, because otherwise there is nothing to remove, just an extra sanity check, you could say. And also be a bit more flexible regarding how elements are attached. I'll add a constructor here to this component, and there I expect to get my host element ID, let's say, and also maybe an insert before argument, and set this to false as a default though. And then here, check if host element ID is set, so if this is passed in, or if it is null or any other falsy value. And then set this host element equal to document get element by ID, so for the case that host element ID is not falsy. If it is falsy, however, in the else case, I'll add a new property host element as well, but then I'll set it to document body, so that we say we could also pass in any other element, any other identifier ID for an element in the DOM. But if we don't pass in a host element ID, we just fall back to using the document body to then append this element which is getting created, which is getting attached and detached. And in addition, insert before can be used. We can store this also in a property. So store insert before in this insert before. And now we can use this in attach to not always use document body append, but instead use this host element to begin with, and then use insert adjacent element actually, and check if this insert before is true. If it is, use before begin here, otherwise use before end, for example. And of course, you could also be more flexible regarding what you accept here as argument. I'm happy with these two options that I can use here. And then add the element there. So now we have a more flexible attach method here, which makes our component more generic and useful in a couple of use cases, not just in the use case where we want to append something at the end of our document body. Because now we can use any element, and there in that element, we can add it at the beginning or the end. So that's a lot of control we added here. Now we just have to adjust our tooltip. There I call super, and super now expects arguments. Now if we pass in null here for a host element ID, we'll fall back to the document body. If we pass in null or nothing for insert before, we'll stick to false, which means it will be added to the end. And since this is exactly what I want to add it in the document body and I want to add it at the end, we can indeed call super like this without any values, because I'm fine with the defaults which are then getting assumed. So if I now reload here, we click more info again, it works like before. But the cool thing is we could now also add some ID. For example, here add active projects. And now you would see if I save that and I reload, now it would be added here at the bottom of the active projects container. Of course, that's not what I want here, but it shows that our generic method works. In addition, if I add true here as a second argument, we would add it at the beginning. So if we now reload, it would be added here before our active projects container. And actually, that shows me that it's not entirely what I want. I should change this here to after begin, because I want to add it at the beginning of the container, not outside of that container. So not before that container, but inside of the container, but there right at the start. And that is what after begin will do. So with that, let's reload and retry. Now this is getting added inside of this active projects container at the very beginning, but inside. Now again, this is not what I want here. So I will remove both from my super call, but for testing this it was useful. And now we have this more generic component, which also allowed us to practice inheritance again. This is it for this practice module. We worked a bit more with classes, with this object-oriented approach. Hopefully, again, that was a useful practice for getting a feeling regarding how you think about object-oriented programming and how you structure your app there. We worked a bit with the DOM, we moved elements around, we worked with event listeners. I also showed you this new callback pattern. We learned about that before, but now you saw it in practice where we passed functions to other instances and to other functions so that from inside there they could be called upon certain events. And with that, we built this little application where we can move items around. And this application will be important. We'll also use it in the next course module. And with that finished, you're well prepared for this module, and you hopefully also got some additional practice with classes and object-oriented programming.